right. Hi, everyone. It's Martin Biedroń from Agile Labs, and we have Mark today to give us a hint on how to mislead with metrics and how to destroy things that are working. Okay, Mark, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me to come. I'm very excited about this and hearing what time it is. You guys are giving up part of your evenings to hear this, so I'm very honored to be asked and very honored you guys are willing to spend this time with me. I work as an Agile coach, and so a lot of what I'm trying to do with teams is I've been on teams that were delivering on a regular basis, making the customer happy, doing great things, and that feels so good to work like that. So that's what kind of my goal in life is, to help teams get to that point where they can feel really, really good and happy about it. Some of the teams I've worked on that we did that, worked with them for 5 years. And after I rolled off and some of the other team members rolled off, went back, I was on vacation and met up with some people that I had worked with. And they're like, I'll probably spend the rest of my life trying to get to that experience again. And they weren't confident they were going to be able to do it. That's what I want to do for software teams, is get them back to that experience. So today's talk is going to be 180 degrees from that. What we're going to be talking about is how to actually destroy an Agile team. And now that may sound crazy, but bear with me. What we're trying to do is look at the things that we may be doing as a team that are actually subverting our efforts, by kind of flipping this on its head and thinking about, what if we were actually asked to go in and subvert an Agile team? So our question here is, your mission, should you choose to accept, is to prevent Evil Incorporated from releasing their fiendish software that they plan to use to take over the world. Okay, so that's our mission. We're going into, you have the opportunity to go into Evil Incorporated and try to infiltrate and mess up their software by doing things that seem good, but are actually going to hurt their ability to deliver. So if you go to, let me paste this in the chat here again, the first link here in the chat is a poll everywhere. Whoops, I'm sorry, that's the wrong one. Let me fix it.
It's okay. I'm sending it right away, so you don't need to worry about it. So you will need to
go and go to that, and you gotta decide: A, you accept; no, you don't accept. Or let me get this thing away from anything flammable before I answer and it self-destructs. I make one other change here so I can see a little better. There we go. Okay. So it looks like most of us are concerned about self-destructing. We've got somebody accept. No one said they don't accept yet. Okay. Okay, we now got more people that are accepting and less worried about the flammable of this thing self-destructing. Okay, so that's our goal. We're going to try to infiltrate an Agile team at Evil Incorporated and prevent them from taking over the world. You will infiltrate Evil Incorporated as a member of an Agile team tasked with creating their vile and heinous application. Should you be discovered, we can only assume you will be dealt an appallingly atrocious fate. The following plan will guarantee you will not get caught. So your mission's directives: do not appear to undermine the project. Do undermine the project and make it fail. The mission plan is, you want to encourage the team to use misleading metrics, and you want to promote the metrics throughout the organization to feign transparency. Make sure Evil Incorporated feels the project is on track until it's too late to fix anything. And this message will self-destruct. Okay, so that's our plan, right? Oh, there, I forgot I made it actually self-destruct. So the message is gone. So let's talk about ways we can go into Evil Incorporated and make them feel like they're doing all the right things, and give them metrics that people will grab onto and try to run with, but will actually undermine their ability to deliver. So first, let's talk about metrics for sizing work. So as an agent here, in your covert experience, what is the single best way to keep teams from delivering in slices that user can experience? So is it A, leave demos until the very end? Is it B, divide stories so people will, with different skill sets, can say they are done with nothing new to actually show the user? C, encourage everyone to spend months building the foundation of the application without any actual user functionality? Or D, make sure that people doing UI and people doing the backend see their jobs as completely separate for each other. So go ahead and vote on that. What do you when your covert experience, what's been the best, you've been training for this for years. What's the best way to keep teams from delivering in slices that users can experience? And all of these are, very valid ways that things I've seen teams. I'm wondering, what have you seen being the biggest barrier, the biggest way to destroy a team's ability to deliver in slices that the user can experience? Okay, so it looks like most of us are kind of down here, making sure that people doing the UI and the people doing the backend see their jobs as completely separate for each other. And that is one way you can really mess up an Agile team's ability to deliver. In second place, we've got to encourage everyone to spend months building foundation of application without any user functionality. That's a very easy thing to sell, right? You can go into Evil Incorporated and tell them, hey, make sure you got the foundation, because if you don't get the foundation in place first, it will really slow you down later. And you can get them to push all the things they need to learn until the very end. And hopefully it'll be too late and their heinous software will be canceled. In third place, got leave demos until the very end of the project. Don't let people actually see what's going on and try it out until the very end. That's another great way we can use to destroy Evil Incorporated. And last one here, divide stories so people with different skill sets and say they're done with nothing to yet show the user. So these are all things that are in your toolkit. Okay, so what we're talking about here is this is very efficient, right? If we think of delivering a software as delivering as a cake, it's very efficient if we can deliver things all the way through, right? You've got the UI at the top with the candles, and you've got the database and the operating system and stuff down at the bottom, and the logic in between. If you can deliver stuff all the way through like that, if Evil Incorporated starts doing that, it's going to be very easy for them to start getting feedback and deliver the application. So what we want you to do as a covert operator is go into Evil Incorporated and don't do that, right? Do it this way. This is very inefficient, right? Tell them we're going to deliver the architectural design all the way through. Everything will be set in stone first. And then we're going to deliver the database layer, and then the business logic layer, and then the user interface on top of that. So you don't actually get to experience it until the whole thing comes together. And hopefully by that time, there'll be enough problems with it that they won't be able to take over the world with it. So this is very inefficient, but you can make this sound really inefficient. And some of the things you might try to say are, you wouldn't build a house without building the foundation first, would you? And that's a hard thing to argue with, particularly if you've got people that think that writing software is like building a house, which it's not, but it sounds really good. So that might be one way you can mess up Evil Incorporated. You can also say, we don't want to have to change code after we've written it. And this kind of goes back to the house example, right? Because if we can get people thinking that building software is like a house where once you lay the foundation, you wouldn't want to change it. But that's the exact opposite of the efficient way to deliver code, which is get something working and then continue to evolve it. So these are really, really good ways to mess up Evil Incorporated. And just in case we had people join a little bit late, let me reiterate what we're doing here. We're talking about, lest it get out that Mark's an Agile coach that tells everybody to do the opposite of what they should be doing. What we're talking about is you've been tasked with infiltrating Evil Incorporated and trying to join an Agile team and help give them metrics that will keep them from being able to deliver their software they're going to use to try to take over the world. So everything we're describing here is not what you would want to do on a team that you want to succeed. This is how you make a team fail. So let's talk about story points versus stories. So story points can be a great way to understand how stories are related to each other in size, but they're really bad if it pushes you toward dividing up work in ways that doesn't deliver working software. Software involves all kinds of unknowns. To slow down the process, keep as many unknowns until as late as possible. And some ways we can do that are push risky things as late in the project as possible. So if there's anything that's really risky, we want Evil Incorporated to wait until the very end to actually discover that maybe some things they were thinking would work don't work. So if they start trying to prioritize stories in terms of the risk of delivering those stories, try to get away from that, because you don't want them to actually bring the risk forward, because that might help them succeed in taking over the world. Encourage business to add more things since the date doesn't seem to change as new features are added. So this is really, really powerful, because if you can get the business just keep putting things on and then act like there's no trade-off, you can get to the point, but especially if you get Evil Incorporated to add features in that aren't actually necessary for their fiendish plans, add those features in, and then prioritize them over the features that they need to actually accomplish their evil goals. So that's one of the things you can do that will really, you get all these things done ahead of time that aren't actually necessary for what they're trying to do, and you can hopefully wreck the project so they can't take over the world. Avoid getting any evidence of what it will actually take to deliver. So we want to make sure that Evil Incorporated doesn't actually experience what it will take to deliver their software until we get to the very end of when they need to go live with it and use it to take over the world. So anything you can do to avoid them getting that evidence will help make sure that they're not able to unleash their evil on the world. Probably need to come up with a better story of exactly what they're trying to do here. Okay, so your mission is to prevent Evil Incorporated from releasing their finished software that they plan to take over the world. So here's some ways we can do that. We can require detailed design before work is started. So like, for example, when you go and join their Agile team, if a developer says, hey, what if we go ahead and start, what's the first user story we can start on to deliver stuff? Say, hey, wait a minute, we shouldn't start writing any code yet. Let's make sure we have a detailed design for the entire application before we actually start on anything. That will push off when they actually start getting experience with writing the code and getting things set up. And spend as much effort on estimating as you can sneak in. Now, this is something that can be really, really good way to thwart the efforts of an Agile team. Keep trying to get them to estimate, because if we estimate something, it has diminishing returns, right? It's useful to know if something is going to take 2 weeks versus 2 months, but if we can start getting them to estimate in hours or even minutes, after a while, it doesn't really matter because your guess is going to be so bad. So, but you can make it sound really, really good, right? You want them to focus on estimating as much as possible so they're not able to actually deliver the software. Because remember, our goal here is to make sure that Evil Incorporated cannot deliver their software. If we were working on an Agile team, we wanted to succeed, we tried to make sure that estimating is something that happens really, really quick and that we don't overvalue our estimating or put effort into estimating that could be better spent on building the software. But with Evil Incorporated, the more time we can get them to spend on estimating, the less time they will have to build their software. Report the definition of a requirement as progress. So this is something I've seen work really, really well for covert agents. You get in and you say, okay, let's report the definition of requirements as progress. So you say, okay, we've got all our requirements done. We're now 20% done with the project, which makes no sense at all. You haven't written any software yet, but you can make that sound really, really good. And you can sell that to Evil Incorporated because they'll feel like they're making progress when they're not and get to the end. So like, for example, we've completed the requirements, so we're 15% done with the project. So this is a brilliant way to mislead Evil Incorporated. You have no evidence at that point that the team can actually deliver anything working to the user, right? But you feel like you made progress because you've gone 15%. So this can be a really, really good way to mislead them. If the developers weren't involved, they may need to redo the requirements after talking to the devs anyway. So that's another good way to mislead them. This implies that the requirements are fixed and there's not going to be any going back and forth between business and development, finding more efficient ways of delivering functionality. So framing it like this helps get us to a situation that will push Evil Incorporated away from collaborating on the best way to deliver software and more focused on, no, here are the requirements that we have to go through. State numbers that are guesses as if you have high confidence that they are true. So for example, one way of doing it, if you want an Agile team to succeed, giving a range, like saying, hey, based on what we know today, we're going to finish sometime between April and September, and we'll keep updating that as we get more information. Well, that gives lots of information telling how much you don't know, right? You're giving a range. But for Evil Incorporated, we don't want them to really understand how ambiguous or how much we don't know. So if you can state a number of when you're going to be done, make it sound really, really precise. Like we're going to finish on April 15th or the second week of April or April 15th or at 3 o'clock on April 15th. That makes it sound like you have high confidence they're true, even though they're just an estimate. Okay, so back to asking you on your best technique for causing confusion with estimates. Which of these techniques have you seen cause the most confusion with estimates that you might want to have in your toolkit for causing Evil Incorporated to fail in their delivery of the application? So A, spending months estimating, because past a certain point, they won't get any more accurate, but everyone will assume that they're less unknowns because you spent so much time on them. Or B, only show a single date. If you show a range, it helps people understand uncertainty. And we don't want Evil Incorporated to know how much uncertainty is actually built around these estimates, because if they are really, really certain, maybe they'll build other things that depend on exactly hitting those dates. And then when that date isn't met, it all falls down like a row of dominoes, and we can prevent all other kinds of plans that we may not even know that they have yet. Make sure you report progress in a way that makes everything look on track to hit the estimates until the very, very end. So reporting progress out, for example, like we mentioned, reporting out the amount of progress we've made in the requirements, anything we can do to make it look like, hey, look how much progress we're making until the end when you're supposed to deliver, and then progress just kind of levels off. And don't change the estimate when you have better evidence of a different date. So on an Agile team that's usually highly productive, being able to give the stakeholders information of saying, hey, based on what we know today, here's the range that we're going to deliver. And next week, we'll update you based on what we've accomplished this week or next sprint. And now the range is maybe wider because there's more unknowns, or maybe it's narrowing, or maybe it's shifted out, or maybe it's brought in. If Evil Incorporated starts doing something like that, we need to watch out, because that means that they're getting good feedback, and we definitely don't want them to have good feedback. If they're getting good feedback, they're going to take over the world, and that's not what we want. Okay, so I'm checking out the chat here. Is this making sense? Is this way too confusing to flip things around? What do you think? What do you think of your mission here? Are you feeling pretty good that it looks like you may be able to prevent Evil Incorporated to take over the world, or maybe afterwards these things might be useful to figure out how to make your teams succeed? We just want to make sure we don't get it backwards, right? This isn't what you want for your teams that you want to succeed. This is what we're doing for Evil Incorporated. Okay, looking good. Avoid any ranges or quantification of uncertainty. So for example, act as if the projected date will never change despite any obvious evidence to the contrary. Now, you've probably never seen this on your teams that you've been working with to be successful, but some places out there will actually give a projected date, and as they approach it, all of the developers know they're not going to meet the date, but what's being given to the stakeholders still says that they're going to meet the date. That's what we want to have happen for Evil Incorporated, right? We don't want to give them any information that they may be behind or might not miss the date, because if they get that information, then they can start being more strategic in what they prioritize. And if they do that, they might have a chance of actually delivering. Organize your work so you show steady progress on the first 90% and then come to a standstill on the last. So if you have ways of delivering, of making it look like you're making progress, we mentioned this with the requirements, but we can do this in a lot of other areas as well. So hide work everywhere you can. We want Evil Incorporated to have lots of hidden work in their project, as much as we can sneak in there. Measure the progress of writing requirements as if it delivered working code to the end user. Try to work in a way where users don't get to try or see anything until the very last stages of the process. Because the more that we can push out them getting to it, Evil Incorporated getting to actually use the software to the very end, the more chances are that there'll be something in it that actually messes up their plan for taking over the world, but they won't know until it's too late to change. Put anything that has return on investment until the very end of the project. Maybe it will be canceled before you even get to that part. So for Evil Incorporated, obviously, their return on investment involves their nefarious plan to take over the world. So we want to make sure that they don't get any of that value early on. If we wanted them to succeed, we'd want to work with them to try to figure out what's the smallest piece we can deliver that will start giving you a return on investment. Because we would want them to start getting that early on. But we don't want Evil Incorporated to actually get any value from the software if at all possible. So we want to push the delivery of value out until the very, very end, even though we can make it sound like we're actually doing Agile. Measure research that doesn't deliver any deployable code as progress. Okay, so this is actually a great one. This is one way that you can, if you infiltrate an Agile team, if you can encourage them to do things like proof of concepts, and especially proof of concepts that aren't anywhere in the problem domain. So for example, Evil Incorporated has the software that's going to take over the world. We don't know everything about it, but we're pretty sure it's not going to be a bookstore. So if you can encourage them to do a proof of concept bookstore to make sure that they know how the cloud application works and they know how their builds work, they won't get any experience in the actual problem domain that they have. They'll get to work with the technology, but if you can measure all that research and proof of concept as, yes, now we are 30% done because we built all these proof of concepts, it will be great because they'll really still have no experience in the actual problem domain. They will get some experience maybe in the programming techniques, no experience in the actual problem domain, and it makes it feel like they made a lot of progress forward when they actually haven't. The developers still don't actually have experience trying to deliver working software that helps them reach their fiendish goals. So make sure you end up with a fixed, firm date, a firm fixed date of when the project will be done. This will help create lots of dependencies, like we mentioned, that will fail when it's delivered late, right? If you give a firm fixed date and don't update things as you go, you have a really good chance that they're going to build lots of other plans on top of this, and then the whole thing will come down like a house of cards. Encourage the business to add more things since the date doesn't seem to change as new features are added. And particularly if you can get some of those new things that are nice to haves prioritized over the things that they need to go live, then you'll be in a great place to make sure that their project fails. Act like the number of developers is the biggest factor in calculating the date. So this is a really, really big one, right? If you can try to come up with a situation where if they start noticing and being concerned that you're not going to get done on time, try to get them to hire more developers, because that will slow things down. And under most circumstances, that's going to slow things down even more, but it will make them feel like they're doing something because they're hiring and adding more people to it, and they'll keep waiting for it to start going faster, even though they have no evidence that would actually happen. I was working on a successful project a while back that was doing the exact opposite of everything that we're describing here. They had originally been quoted that the project would take 5 years, 50 developers, and cost $50 million. And it was going to be a firm fixed date. Now, every other thing that the people that had quoted this had tried to deliver had never delivered on that firm fixed date and had always cost way more. So chances are it would have been way more. By doing the opposite of what we've been describing here for Evil Incorporated, we were able to deliver go live in 4 years with only 5 devs, and it cost $15 million. So having these, if we can push Evil Incorporated to do things that are going to make it cost really, really, really expensive and possibly fail, we'll be in a lot better situation. We want to avoid anything that would get them to where they can deliver this in a shorter period of time with a few number of devs and a smaller budget. Okay, so that was metrics for measuring works. So let's look at metrics for actually doing work. So that was metrics, I think, we called it for measuring progress. Let's look at metrics for doing the work. So cycle time. So here is this is actually a graph from a client of mine, a successful client of mine, of how long it took to get a story from the time it was asked for through to production. And if you see over here, they started out taking about 60 days, and then we were in 48, then 41, then 39, and it came down all the way over here to where we were finally delivering in about 9.5 days all the way through to production. And actually, after this, it went down, and they finally got to the point where they were delivering features through to production overnight. So it was taking about 8 hours from the time something was started on until it was delivered and the customers were using it. This is not what we want Evil Incorporated to do. Make sure no one sees this type of chart or you will fail. What you want to have them actually doing is something more like this, right? Flip it around, like where every story takes just a little bit longer because of the way that you're approaching the work and because you put off things and you're not delivering all the way to production or to your highest environment. You want each story to take longer. Now, you don't want to show them this graph, obviously, but this will basically, if you can get something where your cycle time takes longer and longer and longer, this basically shows that Evil Incorporated will never be able to implement their nefarious plans for world domination. So remember, we want to avoid anything that looks like this, where they're getting faster delivering, and do get things like this. So if they're looking at cycle time and really measuring cycle time as trying to improve that, that's a really bad sign for the rest of the world, because it means they're likely to be able to actually take over. It is inefficient. So here's some of the statements we can use to keep Evil Incorporated from asking about cycle time. So you could tell them things like saying, it's inefficient to deploy a single story to production. So this statement is completely false, right? This is not true that it's inefficient to deploy a single story to production, because that gets you, if you focus on being able to efficiently deploy to production, then you're going to be able to deliver and have a high chance of success. But you can say this and make it sound really, really good, right? This will trick Evil Incorporated into creating hidden work. It also helps create a huge bottleneck on deployment. Because if you wait to deploy till the end, there's all kinds of things that are going to go wrong. You're not going to have the right people in place. You're not going to know what permissions need to be there. You won't have invested at every point in trying to automate that process. So, but it sounds really good, right? To say it's inefficient to deploy a single story to production. The most efficient way to work is to take every story through to production and to build that pipeline to do that. But we can try to keep Evil Incorporated from doing that by saying things like it's inefficient to deploy a single story to production. This will keep Evil Incorporated from investing in automation and to lower deployment transaction costs. Remember, we want their transaction cost of getting something through to production to be as high as possible. We can make it sound like they're doing the right thing by saying stuff like this while really thwarting their plans. And this sets up a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If I don't try to deploy something through to production, then it's going to be very costly to deploy to production. So then we can actually prove that it's inefficient to deploy a single story to production because we've created an environment in which it is inefficient to deploy a single story to production. So we can set up the self-fulfilling prophecy, and then it looks like we're saying all the right things, and it looks like we are right, even though we've really misled them in the best way to deploy software. So it's inefficient to deploy a single story to production. Here's another statement. Writing code is the most important thing. Let's wait to test and deploy. So if you can say this, it sounds good, like, right? Because we want to focus on the functionality. But this will keep Evil Incorporated from thinking about what produces actual value. It makes them think they're focused on actual value, but it misleads them, because what we really want is software that does what we expected it to do, and that we know does what it's expected to do, and that we can trust to do what it's expected to do. If we just focus on code and we never worry about whether it actually does what we expect, we can push that till the very end and then discover all kinds of issues. Metrics based on this are going to make teams think they are more complete than they are. So for example, if we measure a story as being done just when it's been completed code, but it hasn't been pushed to production and you don't have any tests around it, it makes you feel like you're making great progress, but you're pushing all that work until the very end. So that will help mess up Evil Incorporated. If they start really thinking about measuring all the way through, like we took this, we've met all the QA requirements and we deployed this to production, that's bad for the world, because that means they are going to be getting good feedback that they can use to take over. So this violates the Agile principle about the primary measure of progress being working code, code that does work, code that we prove does work. And I would define it, the Agile principle of primary measure of progress, working code, meaning the code is actually doing work. You've got it into production to where it's actually producing value. Proving out assumptions helps development. Proving them on a different project slows development down. So if we can use this to get people focused more on planning, we have a higher chance of wrecking their project. Encourage Evil Incorporated to prove out assumptions in ways that don't actually prove out assumptions. So if we can get them to try to prove, hey, look how much code we've written. We've delivered all this stuff, but it hasn't been tested and hasn't been deployed. They'll feel they're proving out their assumptions of deploying code and getting their velocity through without actually doing that. So some of the another metric here. So we're going to talk about velocity. And so let me ask you a question first here. What is the best way to make Evil Incorporated's velocity metrics mislead the project? Is that poll working for you? Okay, good, it's working. So A, encourage a definition of done that leaves a lot of work to the end. Definitely don't include it in let it include going to production. So that would be a situation where we want to have a definition of done that hides lots of work. So you could say we're 75% through with the application and hide the fact that you still need to deploy it, you still need to test it. I have seen some projects where people were working on things, and because they didn't include actually testing, particularly automated testing, as part of their definition of done for stories, they would get one story through and create on average 2 or 3 bugs for every story that went through. And they're like, no big deal, we'll just put that on the backlog. Well, by doing that for a few years, by the time they had done that for a few years, they had more work to do than they had started with when they hadn't written a single line of code, because they had all this stuff done, in quotes, but they had more problems to solve than they actually had before they had any code, because they weren't building it as part of the process. And that can be, you can make that sound really, really good, but it will destroy the project. In this case, it destroyed a very large project. I think they had spent about $60 million on, and didn't get anything useful out of. So B, make sure testing is a separate activity. You want everyone to feel like they're completing work, even if it is creating more work. So like we described, it looks like that's where most of us are saying that's one of the best ways to get velocity metrics to mislead the project. Do your best to make teams feel that velocity is being compared across teams. So if you can get people to start thinking about how velocity is compared across teams, you can encourage some really, really weird behavior. So instead of thinking of, if you're doing that, people are going to start either, on one hand, they will start either padding all their things to make it look like they're doing more work, so their velocity looks better to other teams, or they'll start splitting stories in ways that make absolutely no sense at all, just to be able to say that they completed more stories. So that can be a great way to throw things off. Try to create lots of stories that are useless by themselves and are really just part of the work of other stories. So, for example, I have seen teams even have a story to change a password on the database. They had a story to change a password that they were using to measure their velocity in their process, that somebody was going to go in and spend 60 seconds changing the password on a database. So you get enough of those things in the mix, and it's really, really hard to tell how the project is actually doing, which is exactly what we want for Evil Incorporated. So if Evil Incorporated creates a chart that looks something like this, this is going to be very dangerous for us, because velocity in this chart includes everything involved in getting to the point where there is return on investment for Evil Incorporated. So notice they're keeping track right here that we're starting with ready, we're going through requirements, development, QA, testing, accepted by user, production, and then done after it's actually been deployed in production, which means they're actually getting value from it. So worse, this makes it easy to measure cycle time and spot bottlenecks. Evil Incorporated measuring cycle times is much more dangerous than if they're measuring story point velocity, because if they're measuring how long it takes them to get something through to production, that is tied a lot more to their success than just the velocity of story points. If we can get them to do something like this, notice here, this board hides all the work of getting to production, right? We feel like we're making great progress. We've done our requirements, we've done development, we've done testing, and now we're done. That's great, because they haven't actually deployed anything. Maybe they could build a huge piece of software and then discover that it's impossible to deploy, which means they couldn't carry out their nefarious plans. But this is even better. If we can get them to do something like this, this is a brilliant way to stop Evil Incorporated. If you can get them to take off that testing column, that's even better, because it means they're going to have a bunch of stuff that's done. And not only do they have no evidence they can deploy it to production, but they also don't have any evidence it even works, right? And every other story that they bring through has a chance of breaking the stuff that's already there. So this was, I mean, you do this and you can completely shut them down. And it's easy to sell this, right? Because if you have a chart that looks like this, you can tell people, well, that's going to take too long and it's too complicated, and maybe getting to production is really hard. And do we really want the developers to feel they haven't accomplished anything just because it hasn't been accepted by the user or tested? Because those are handled by other teams. So you can make a really, really good case, good meaning it sounds good, but it will mislead them for trying to do something like this. But this will totally wreck their ability to deliver. When problems are discovered, they get put back on the backlog. And if you do your job well, Evil Incorporated will soon be creating new work faster than they are finishing it, like that project I told you about. So we come over here, we have a problem, and it goes back to ready. Pretty soon their backlog just grows. And if you can get them focused just on the number of stories that were originally in the backlog, they'll lose track of the fact that it's growing faster than the things are being completed. So if we think of a graph something like this, we started with a number of stories, and we've got functional stories coming down here. Keep everyone focused on where we are on this velocity, like how many functional stories have we finished, if they're thinking of functional stories. If you can get them focused on things other than functional stories, you have a good chance of making it, like the proof of concept. You can mess them up even more. But what's really happening right here is there's all these fixes that need to be done, and that's growing faster. But don't let them think about that. Let them just think about how the functional stories, how you're making good progress. They'll get over here and think that they can go live and take over the world, but really they've got all these problems here that will just totally mess up the system. Avoid calling out this part, right? If we can keep Evil Incorporated from looking at how big their overall backlog is to deliver to production, if we can keep them from thinking in terms of that, we have a better chance of messing them up. If they start looking and saying, how many stories do we have left, including any bug fixes, before we can deploy live, that's going to be bad for the rest of the world because they're going to have good insight to what things actually look like. Work in progress. So here's another way we can mess them up. If you see a board like this is a bad sign, right? Because they've got work in progress limits. Those numbers up there are saying we're not going to have more than 2 things in any of these columns. Well, that's a scary thing, because if they're doing that, it probably means that they're going to be focused on delivering stuff all the way through and reducing their cycle times, which might make them feel like they're going slower at first, but it puts them in a position to really improve their delivery process all the way through. So if they're using cycle time like that, that's a bad sign for us, because it means they have a chance of succeeding. Now, if you wanted a project to succeed, having the work in progress limits in there so people are focused on how to get something all the way through will really help them deliver the software, which isn't what we want for Evil Incorporated. So some of the things you can do is that, what if developers don't have anything to work on? Isn't that inefficient? So this is how you can talk them out of actually having work in progress limits. Or you could say, if a developer gets stuck, don't we want them to find something else to work on? Or isn't it isn't the developer's problem that QA isn't ready for this? If the testers aren't done, let them go ahead and just keep pulling in more work. You could say, we can't have any idle time if we want to be inefficient, which is completely false, but it sounds really, really good. So if you do your job well, you can get to this point. You want to aim for this. So pretty soon, nothing will actually get completed, where they just keep adding so many things to the board that everything's blocked and nothing is actually getting finished, because whenever there's any type of barrier, they start a new story. And any type of barrier for that, they start a new story. And pretty soon they can get to the point that they don't even remember the first story that they were working on. And the context switching, this will really, really slow Evil Incorporated down. Focus the team on metrics tied to how fast they can start work, not on how fast they can complete already started work. So with a situation like this, you can get them really focused on starting new work, so they stay busy rather than on completing work, which is how we actually get value. So metrics for estimating. So third part, we're going to talk about metrics for estimating. What we want to do for Evil Incorporated is get them estimating something like this, like, look how much great progress we're running. We're going to finish sometime between March and April. When the reality is they're probably going to experience something like this, right? Because let's say that getting to production is a lot harder than they think it is, or they haven't actually done QA, and that's going to take longer when they're really focused on the quality. Yes, very, very evil, right? And I'm sure none of you have ever experienced this in your Agile projects. If you have experienced it, I would look really carefully with who suggests. No, I better not say that. Okay. So here's an Agile metric. So here's what they may actually be doing. What we want to do at this point is really what we don't want Evil Incorporated to do is really think about what the range could be. So yeah, we're making great progress up here. We think we're on to 75%, but is it possible that there's something out here that actually makes it to where we're not going to be, we're not actually measuring or estimating what it really looks like to get live. So here's a chart right here. So what we've done here is we've broken up the stories by minimal viable. So let's say the minimal viable for Evil Incorporated to use the software to take over the world. Now they've got some stuff here that's green, so it's necessary, like it's very important. It really needs to be there, but they could execute their plan without it, but it wouldn't be as good, well, good, bad. It wouldn't let them take over the world quite as much. And then there's a lot of cool features they want that are the blue. What you want to do is encourage them to sequence the work like this, right? Start with something that's necessary, but isn't the minimally viable piece of it. Then convince them that you want to do a cool feature, like something that everybody really, really wants, but they could actually go without. Then maybe come back and do a minimally viable, just make sure they don't discover what you're doing. Then do another cool feature. If you do that, you can get to the point where they can't actually use the software for anything until the very, very end. You want to avoid a situation, though, where they start coming in here and start saying, okay, we're going to sequence this work. Okay, so that's this would be a good way to do it. This would be really, really bad. We want to avoid a case where they start with the minimally viable, because then they could possibly go live right here. We want them to have to wait till the very end. And if you try really hard, you can even probably pull this off. Since the cool features are the things that people are most interested in hearing about, you can maybe get them to work on all the cool features before they work on any of the actual stuff they have to go live. So you get everybody focused on all the cool features and you build out all the cool features, but you don't build any of the stuff that would let you actually run the software altogether. Yeah, maybe just enough to be able to demo some piece of it, but you can't actually deploy it, can't actually use it in production. Then you build the necessary stuff. And then finally you get over here to doing the things that are the minimally viable, the stuff that you actually have to have as the smallest thing that would let the software actually run. If you can get them to sequence the work like this, and this is surprisingly easy to do. If you can get them to sequence the work like this, you can get to the point, if there's anything that slows stuff down, it pushes the data out, and hopefully you'll push the data out beyond when they would be able to actually take over the world. Okay. So that is an overview of how I'm encouraging you to go in and destroy Evil Incorporated. And I hope the switch back and forth was okay.